name is Andy Fittall. I've been working on a project with Athena and Andy Mutro-Reid, who's in the background there, on a project called the Help Desk, which is a government-funded project through the West Footscray Traders Association in conjunction with the Inner West Community Foundation. And the purpose of the project is to identify the critical issues facing business in West Footscray, specifically the traders first, and also in the greater 3012 region. Identify those problems, see if there's anything that we can do to help connect people to experts in the fields that they require some help in, and also to run these workshops. So we are towards the end of the project. And these workshops are a result of the surveys and the interviews that we've done. These were the topics that people wanted to discuss and get some more information on. In fact, grants was overwhelmingly the favourite. So I think now more than ever, it's a good thing to learn about grants. So at that point in the story, I'm going to hand over to our grants guru, Athena Thompson, who has significant history in the grants writing space. We also welcome Nick Cooper, who is a grant writer as well. We have here in our wings, we've got Bruce Marshall from the Maribyrnong Council, and we may get another member shortly, but we'll see how we go. And so I'll hand it over to you, Athena. Give us the goods on grant writing.
Today, what I'm hoping to get through is the philosophy behind why and how to approach grants, where to find them, best websites to do that, the general process, how to plan it out, structure, types of things that are in it, what you need to do to make your submission count, what happens with the end result, and what to do after you've actually got a successful agreement. And so throughout these presentations today, to make it a bit more interesting, I'm going to throw it over to Nick now and again to have his input and insight. And if you've got a question, as Andy said, just pop it in the chat box and we'll work our way through it. And then at the end, we'll open up if you've got questions specific to your needs. So first up, most people come to me and say, what grants are there? Where can I get money from? Where's the first place I can get dollars? And I take a step back and say, let's start and have a look at your business. What do you need? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to achieve? What are the projects that you have got on the go? Because the philosophy is that you should be starting with a project first and then finding a grant to match the potential needs of that project, because it means that you're more likely to do the project with or without funding, that you've already got the contacts and resources in place, and it's more likely you're going to be able to be sustainable to keep on delivering on similar projects to look at it. And so when you don't have, you start with, let's try and design the project to fit the grant, quite often it's not as planned as it's unplanned. It doesn't necessarily fit with your priorities, let alone theirs. And it means it's harder to repurpose. So always start with what's your needs as a business, and then investigate the landscape to see what's actually out there. Nick,
Hi.
when you my question to you is, when you see businesses chase grants, how do they succeed if they do build the project based on the grant? What's your experience?
Sure, that's a good question. Generally, as a rule, in my experience, any grant application that I've worked on that involves a project that came about as a result of a funding program or opportunity, or for instance, after the fact, has tended to be firstly harder work, and secondly, it's been significantly less likely to be successful, in my experience. Just because what I call opportunistic projects, they tend to lack the authenticity and practical utility of a pre-existing project that's already there, that's already part of the business. as you mentioned before. And having been on the other end of those applications as a panelist or an assessor, this does tend to shine through the genuineness, I suppose, of the application and the project. So with such highly competitive funding rounds, especially at the moment as a result of COVID and as a result of, rightly so, more funding opportunities, they are super highly competitive. So if the criteria isn't exactly met with strong supporting material demonstrating the suitability of the project, then it's less likely to rise to the top. And I kind of use a bit of a panel beating analogy. It's a great fit between a project and a funding program is always going to be a great fit. But if you've panel beaten your project into the project guidelines to make sure it's eligible for funding, it tends to not shine as well, and it will tend to be an imperfect sort of fit.
Thanks, Nick. So because everyone here is basically in the city of Maribyrnong, and Bruce can touch, we'll ask Bruce a little bit later in Annetta to expand on this, but the city of Maribyrnong has a website with a few resources to help you with grants. Then beyond just looking at City of Maribyrnong, I guess there's different areas. So we start at the government, within government, and we have different federal programs. And programs come out of the different departments depending on what their priorities are to fund. Then second to that, you've got state funding. So you look at Vic Health or Vic Business. And then you've got local government being the local council. Then on the other side, if you're a community organisation or a social enterprise, there's a number of different foundations that are out there, like the Sydney Myer Foundation. You do have different philanthropic organisations, but usually they're tied to being a charity. You also have donor groups as well as corporates. And so occasionally you might see something like Coles or Woolworths sort of put out funding for different businesses as well. Then you also have international, and there's a big spread of those. You might have seen a couple of different little Facebook grants that have come out for small business or Google from time to time. So they do pop up. In terms of where to find them on the internet, if you did just a Google search, I just want you to be aware there's a couple of sites out there that have a .org.au at the end, and they're actually just a grants business, and they're trying to find a different way to bring you in. I find that if you go to the source of the information for those grants is the best place to go. So I've got a whole bunch of lists there. So Grants Connect goes across all the departments for federal level, and you can do a quick search by keywords on there as to what's open. You can also register on their website against a couple of keywords that might be in your interest, specific to what you need. You've also got the business.gov.au, as well as one specific to arts, which I'll get Nick to expand on in a little while. Then at the state level, going straight to vic.gov.au, grants, and then there's a couple where you can go straight to the department level. So typically with the Victorian government ones, when you go to that vic.gov.au grants, you land on their page, and if it comes under another department, they'll then send you across to Sustainability Vic or Creative Vic or Vic Health. And I've named these ones here because from time to time, each year they'll have some kind of round that's might be specific to your business and potential use. So with Sustainability Vic, they quite often have things around recycling, energy efficiency, solar panels. So there's always going to be something at some point in the year. It's just being every now and again checking in. Again, you can register on their site to get regular updates. Vic Health, the same again. Every year they'll have 1 to 2 rounds in different areas. Vic, from your experience with Creative Victoria, how often do they do their rounds and who do they focus on?
Thanks, Athena. They tend to have major funding rounds, and then they often have ad hoc minor funding rounds. So the Music Works program, for instance, is a large, well-funded sort of fund, and it breaks down to different areas. So there's touring aspects of it. There's more creative aspects to it. There's business aspects to it. So it's usually once a year that major funding round is open. Occasionally it's twice a year, as you mentioned, but it's always worth keeping an eye on their website and on two other newsletters, like, for instance, Music Victoria, for an industry-specific angle, of course, because they do tend to announce any of those sort of pop-up, one-time, limited time kind of opportunities. Because there was, for instance, some of the COVID funds, there were some live music professionals kind of survival style funds that came out halfway through last year, which weren't otherwise part of the major funding rounds. Yep.
And currently there's a couple of grants that are open with Vic Gov. So you may have seen the Circuit Breaker grant. So with that particular one, it's open for the next 3 weeks for businesses that fall within their eligibility criteria. And if you're looking at that one, it shouldn't take you an hour to put it through. And if it's taking you longer than that, then it sounds like you might need a hand, and that's a good time to call on extra help to get through it. And the other one, which you may have seen thrown around, was the digital adaptation through VicGov, which basically says if you buy an online software tool like Xero, a subscription for a year, you can get that money refunded to you. So those are really 2 straightforward programs that are out there at the moment that are currently open. Yes, Sandy.
So I just wanted to, you've touched on a point there that I think we've talked about a lot, but I'd like to, if you could just elaborate a little bit, the time it takes you to fill in the grant versus the size of the grant. Could you please just elaborate a little bit on that theory, which helps, I think, people form the concepts around whether or not they should be applying for grants or not?
I think that's a really good question, and that kind of takes me to the whole next point, which is the process. So once you've found the grant on any one of these websites that fit within your project, have a look at what's required and the amount of time and the amount of funding. And there's a real balance between risk and reward. How long is it going to take me to fill out this application? It turns out it's going to take you a lot longer to fill out than you could go and potentially earn the income otherwise through revenue. Then it's not worth doing. And so that's why I guess I touched on that circuit breaker. It shouldn't take you longer than an hour. It shouldn't eat into more time than that. And so it's that constant having a think about how much work is going to be involved for me to actually do that particular grant application. Yes, Nick.
And that probably applies as well to whether you have the resources or could justify getting someone else to help, someone like me, for instance, as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Is it so big that I should start looking at different writers to help me actually look at it? So certainly the other things that you think about alongside of, well, how much funding is there? Is it worth the time to write? Is to have a look at people who've applied before and been successful when there has been multiple rounds. Have a look at what other people that you might be able to collaborate with and to partner with. I often see that when you have good, strong partnerships or allies for a grant application, that they'll look on it more favourably because they can see that 2 parties are coming together to come to a common good. Nick. Well, I can't hear you, Nick. You might need to. Yeah.
Thank you.
There we go.
It happens sooner or later. I just thought it was worth mentioning as well that most grant programs are quite transparent, and they do publish lists of previous successful applicants and applications. So there's every chance that you can Google that program, look at the past recipients, and you could even pick up the phone or email them and say, look, would you mind giving me an idea of how much time it took? Was it worthwhile? Do you have any tips? Because most people are out there to help each other, especially if they've already got the funding. They're going to be more likely to want to help someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. People are happy to tell you how long it's taken them to do and to go again, because it's unlikely, like you said, they're going to try and apply again for the same grant because they've already received the funding. So that takes me to planning. have a think about when you start to put the application together, what process you want to put in place. So I'll typically set up a folder, put in all the documentation that I'll need for that particular grant, and I'll also take the application form, which is typically online. They normally have an online form. I'll take the questions and pop them into a Google Doc or a Word doc so I can record all my answers there. That also means that if I want someone else to review my writing, that they can review it. And it also is less likely that it will get lost in the system. There's been a couple of times where I've plugged it all in and then the system's crashed. It hasn't saved, internet's dropped out. So it's just a good way to help minimise those types of issues. Nick, what have you got to add for that one? Microphone on, please.
Thank you, 100%. As far as the workflow goes, it's really important to make sure that ideally there's one dedicated person that's plugging things into the portal, or at least at any one time. So if there's more than one person working on a project, just setting out who's going to do what and when, so that there's not some work being done in one section, someone's doing work in the other, and then someone clicks save and they exit it and all of a sudden the work's not saved. So I've seen that happen before. It's heartbreaking. You never know how much you've done and you never quite get the exact words back. So Google Docs are really good to draft the application as a whole outside of the portal. I tend to find that setting up a Google document with the actual grant guideline questions, the criteria in there, you can edit that. You can do that at the same time. You can see who's changing what, and then you can upload it later.
Yeah, I really like that approach. One other thing I like to do is right at the end is have someone else go through and check it off. I can see that Andy's got his hand raised. But do you want to chip in, Andy?
Oh yeah, I was just going to add as well, in light of the fact we're talking to small businesses, and I know that you're going to talk about this later, is you do save in a Word doc, then there's opportunities for small business owners to maybe send a preview of what they want to submit to maybe yourself or to Nick. It just makes it really simple. So rather than just going straight into the portal, delivering it, put into a Word doc, and if you want someone with some experience or profession just to review it for them, then that just makes it a real simple way to do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes it much easier to review on our part. So going on to our next step. So after I've reviewed, looked at the grant, I start to actually get into to do some homework around what do I need to show for evidence to get this grant past the line, and looking at different sources of data to help with the impact of your grant. And so a couple of those really simple ones are going to ABS, knocking on the door of council and saying, actually, do you have some statistics for our area on this type of element? And they've been really great in actually coming back, as well as access to a website called Profile ID. So at the end of this talk, we'll send through a worksheet that actually steps through and gives you some ideas around that. And so that data, whether it's a news article, I start to do all that homework. Nick, did you have another suggestion on places to go to for data outside of the ABS statistics and Profile ID?
Yeah, I do. In the past, I've found that peak bodies, industry peak bodies or industry bodies can tend to have reports that will show key data like size of industry, economic impact, those sort of things. So they're usually pretty easily found on a resources page of an industry peak body website, for instance. Also, Business Victoria, so government agencies, for instance, will have that key data sitting somewhere. You can always extract the data that you need from, whether it's a census or an annual report or an economic impact report or whatever it might be. You'll tend to find something handy from there as well.
Actually, that reminds me, Andy passed me the other day the environmental scan for our area, which talks more about education and education type base. But looking at the group here, that might not be as relevant. But they're called the environmental scans from LLEN, and it tells you if, I guess it's more related maybe to staffing, which is good to know that that's out there. So then after working out, all right, is it worthwhile going? how am I going to structure this? Do I have good data? That's at the point that I actually get to the writing. And after this slide, we'll go through the actual structure of some of those things that you need to write to. My last tip in all of this is when you go to submit, do not leave it to the last day. I recommend giving yourself at least one day to go plug it in, because again, just from the sheer volume of people trying to lock in their stuff on that last day, the websites just tend to slow down, and that's just the nature of it. It just gives you that little bit of time to get it in. If there's any technical issues, that you've got time to give them a call and check in that they've received it if you're unsure that it's actually been submitted or not by the deadline, because they are really strict with their deadlines. And right at the moment, it's a quite competitive environment for grants. And then lastly, check that you've got that receipt. You should get an email that says it's been submitted. And if you don't have that, that's pretty much immediately that there's a good reason to check. Did you want to add anything to that last comment on submission, Nick?
No, I think the 1 day rule is a good one. Ideally 48 hours. I've just so many times I've found that a client will scramble for information. When you're trying to get in the portal, they said they've got everything, but they've just written on one thing. All of a sudden you're trying to lay your hand on that particular supporting material or whatever it is. So it just gives you time to take a breath, lock it all in there, save the application before you submit it. Ideally go back the next day, check through it all again, make sure everything's sitting where it should be, check all the attachments are uploaded, and then you can click go. Cool.
So most grant applications will have similar structures and ask for similar information. How much or the level of detail really comes down to how much money you're asking for. So they'll step through the eligibility, the types of organisation, whether you're allowed to as a sole trader or whether you have to be a PTY Ltd. Now, just because you're not eligible because of your company structure doesn't mean that you couldn't partner with someone else that is. And actually that brings me to auspicing, which I didn't cover off. Nick, can you talk a little bit about what an auspice organisation does?
Sure. So an auspice or an auspice organisation in a funding context is an organisation that will manage that grant funding application on your behalf. So they'll potentially help you apply for it, but they'll actually manage the funding, the actual dollars. So for example, a small community group with limited resources may use a larger non-profit organisation as their auspice. There's plenty of them around. There's some local ones. There's some art-specific, industry-specific ones, like there's lots of arts ones. So the larger non-profit or the larger organisation will actually receive and manage that grant funding on behalf of the applicant. And then the applicant will still undertake the project work, but that's, I suppose, another level of, management on behalf of the grant program might require a higher level of funding management and experience and size and things like that.
Yeah, and it's kind of helpful for levels of insurance too, I guess, when you're asking for funding if you don't have it in place. So that's an option. The other thing I think about is if I'm not eligible, is my client eligible or my customer? So maybe I can't access it, but can I help my customer access it? So it's a different way to think about it. Then you get into the eligibility of the project. So they'll tell you what money you can spend for what types of things that marry up to their priorities. So sometimes it might be capital, it might be equipment, it might be training. Sometimes they don't include overhead, sometimes they don't, but they'll specify how that funding can be used. And sometimes things can't be included in it and sometimes it can't. And that just changes from each grant.
So I've got a great point here from Mary in that running lots of arts events, but we are a structured company, not a non-for-profit, so often frozen out of arts funding. So we talk about auspicing. As an example, say, can you think of something off the top of your head, a workaround to doing this for Mary? So as she's not a non-for-profit, how might she be able to tackle some of these grants in an auspice sort of situation?
So I know Nick's raised his hand, so I'm going to pass to him in a second, but this is a really good example of where you could engage the Inner West Community Foundation to look at those community-directed grants and how they might be able to be the applicant and be the auspice organisation to project manage it, because they're structured as a not-for-profit. There's also some requirements with some of those types of programs that also require a charitable status. So that's one option. But Nick, I saw that you had your hand raised. I figure you've got some more to add to that specific to the arts events.
Yeah, I was going to give you a plug first, so you beat me to it. But you're right, there's other auspicing organisations that's specifically what they do as their core business. So, of course, they will take a cut of or a percentage of the funded amount generally, or they might have a fee arrangement in place, but generally it's a percentage of the overall amount requested. They will then manage that funding. And, of course, that's something you factor into your budget, but if it's at the price of not receiving it or using them, then you actually get a chance at the funding, then that's generally worthwhile. There's an arts-specific one called Auspicious Arts, which is one that I know of. There's another place called the Grants Hub, which do some grant things as well. Actually, sorry, they're more of a grants resource opportunity, but there's lots in the arts, basically, for this particular situation.
Yeah, so I guess, that's locally. And so in terms of talking to someone about looking at that potential, it's having a chat with Andy and myself, or even Nick. So just back on structure. So funding for grants might be that you can get 100% of the funding, much like those circuit breaker ones where you get your $2.5 grand or your $5 grand. But typically what I see is that you'll have a contribution or a co-contribution, and that can range anywhere from 30% to 50%. Or 75%, and it just varies depending on what the industry is and what the purpose of that funding is. Vic Health ones more recently, most of them have had no in-kind contribution or cash contribution, and that's something else to think about, whether it's also, you might need to show a cash contribution and an in-kind. And so what that means is that you're able to demonstrate you've got the dollars on the table to actually help fund that project going forward, whereas in-kind might be I'm helping do the work to actually get it past the line. So it's a little bit different, but it's basically putting a value to your time in terms of the organisation and structure. And sometimes that's good to speak to, even though they might not ask how much in-kind, but to talk about how you're contributing it into it in addition to what the funding ask is. Because typically I find that you do a project, but there happens to be project management or a post-review that might not fall into that funding. And so when you go back to the eligibility of how that money can be used, and you talk about, all right, I'm asking for the money to do this, but for this overall project to be successful, I'm actually going to have to do some extra things to make it worthwhile. And so you can talk a little bit about that. Yes, Nick.
It's also important for that to find its way into your budget. So that actual in-kind contribution does have a dollar figure. If you can't have it might not have an exact dollar figure, but it has value. So it's worth adding that to the budget at the top end, as far as an in-kind income at the top end, and then as an in-kind expenditure at the bottom end. And sometimes that's a good way to help your budget balance as well.
A good point. Then we go into the merit criteria, and this is where you sell your story. This is where you talk about the impact, you talk about the need, and how you're actually going to change that. The other really important aspect, which they all ask for, is your capability. And what you're trying to demonstrate there is that if they're going to give you the money, you're the person or the entity, the organisation that can spend it well and do this project well, because you've done it before. And so you can talk about other things that you've done in your business to show that success. Maybe it's, how long, might be testimonials of what your customers have said, how other projects that you've done within your entity to help tell that story. So it's really about demonstrating that success. And so typically with that merit criteria, while they ask for your capability and your impact, they want you to tell the story against their priorities. So whilst it's really putting on that lens of what do they need. One of the other things, I guess, is once I've got the form up and I've got the question in front of me and I've written my story, is that I'll go back and I'll have a look, what are the things that they asked for in that merit criteria, and did I actually really cover off what they asked for, or am I telling them what's important to me? So you really got to put yourself in their shoes and tell the story from so that they can understand that. And that's where I find that when you have someone who knows nothing about your project comes in and has a read of it and see if they can poke holes through it. Yes, Nick.
That's a really good one. Getting that sort of what you might call a layperson or an external person. I call it the auntie test. Could you explain it to your auntie? Does it make sense to your auntie? If it does, then it's probably all good to go. If your auntie's got no idea what you're talking about, then it might need a little tweak.
Yeah, I like that. Mine's been the grandmother test, but yeah.
Uncle.
Yeah. And so, cool. Then, depending on the size of the grant, of the funding that you're looking at, they may ask for a project plan, and they will give you a template of what that project plan needs to cover. But they're pretty much similar. What's your objective? What's your milestones? What are your deliverables? How much is it going to cost you? And what are your resources to do it? And the bigger the project, the more risks are involved. So they may ask for a risk matrix. So when you go through each of those deliverables and milestones, you stop and you think, what could possibly go wrong? Pop it down, whether it could be low, medium, or high risk. And the important thing here isn't how big the risk is, it's how you manage it. What are you going to put in place to deal with it should it go wrong? And a really popular one right now is if you're going to do an event and you come into restrictions, what's your alternative? So having just to think about what the alternative is, that you're still able to proceed, but that's nice and strong. They'll all ask for a costing and budget, and they may ask you to break it down in different ways. Nick, did you have any tips on how to do a strong budget or costing for a project?
Yeah, often they have templates already. So Creative Victoria, for instance, has a budget template, and they expect that those heads of costs will be reflected in your project budget. So it's always easy to use something that they've provided for you or they've suggested you use first. And you can always make whatever you've got fit into their categories, even if it's not an ideal fit for your project. As long as it gets into their language and into their categories, it's more likely to get approved. That's probably the main thing, I think.
Cool. Then they may ask for additional documents, so letters of support. Letters of support are a wonderful way to help tell your story about the impact that you're going to make and what you can do with the project, and also talk about some of your capabilities. So where you might have missed off in the merit criteria to really explain it, you can use those letters of support from other organisations to really help tell that story. I had a lovely story from a woman who runs a makeup business in Yarraville who applied for a grant for her, and she had letters of support from her clients. And the feedback she received was they were such heartfelt stories that the funders were so amazed with these stories that that's why they wanted to give her the grant, that actually made the difference for her, and that they wanted to use her as the promotional point for those stories. So if you can, use them, because it's an extra tool that's really going to be able to show your point of differentiation from the rest of the competitors that are out there. Typically, when they ask for financial statements, that's when we're looking at much larger grants. So I would say financial statements, I haven't seen asked unless it's around 50K or more. Quotes, that just depends on the funding body. and what you're asking for. So if you're asking for a laptop, they might ask for a quote, or if you've included graphic design, that you've had that quote incorporated, and that just changes from different funding bodies. Sometimes I leave it open for you to add what you like, and that gives you the chance to either put in things like a project plan, even though they haven't asked for it, or any other sort of supporting materials. Nick, sorry, what would you like to add to that point?
No worries. Just on the quote thing, sometimes you might not have enough time to get the quote, but it's always worth, if you don't have that time, just to put in quote to be provided on request. That way, you're buying yourself some more time. They know that you're a bit more serious. It doesn't really cost you anything to do. It doesn't mean much, but it just puts them in the frame of mind that you actually got your hands out there getting the quotes already.
Yeah. And sometimes I found some of the funders might give you some feedback on what's reasonable as well. That they might have an idea of what usual expenditure would be for those types of things, because it's not the first time they've seen a grant application. It's usually it's around that they've seen before, so I have a good idea for what's a normal range as well. The one on insurances, sometimes they'll ask you to provide the insurance certificate, as well as sometimes they ask for your incorporation as well, or registration for your business, and that just changes from funding body to funding body. And whether they've been linked to the ABN lookup site or not. Nick?
Another one in the venue and entertainment and hospitality space is licensing. So they might ask, for instance, for like a one music license or a liquor license or any of those things. They might ask for a planning red line of the venue to see the capacity, things like that.
Yep, cool. So I just want to touch on, if you're doing all this work for a grant application and you're looking at all these different types of merit criteria and project plan, there's definitely information in there that you can reuse in other parts of your business and that you can recycle. And I sometimes find that a grant is a really good way for you to refresh that information. So quite often people will have an about section on our website. It gets you really thinking about who you are and the impact that you're making, so that you can update it and include that information there. What's happened in the last year, a whole bunch of things that you might not have thought about that you could really include there. And so just going back to the areas that I see that you can do that, or even the project plan. So if you're not successful on a specific grant, there's no reason why you couldn't take that project plan and either bring down the scope and try and roll it out in a different way, or pick it up and have a look again at what's out there in the grant landscape to say, all right, who else can I apply with? Where else can I use this project plan? Where else could it actually fit with their priorities? And then the other area, which is, there's so many elements that are similar to what they ask you in a grant application, is very similar to the awards sector. So if you're capturing about your capability, how well you're doing, the impact of what you're going to do, it's very similar to that. So there's lots of areas that you could repurpose or recycle it. So I'm going to throw it to Nick now. In your experience, Nick, what do you see is making a grant application successful?
Good question. So some elements that I've included are giving yourself plenty of time. We've already discussed plenty of time to complete the application, but also allowing adequate time to ensure that the program is the right one for your project. So getting your head around, spending some time at the front end to get your head around the guidelines and the actual objectives of the funding program to make sure that they then align with your project. Because the more time you spend on that, the easier it is to actually write your application when you know what the 3 criteria are that they're after and what are their desired outcomes of the actual program. So I think that's a really good way to get ahead of the game, or at least get right into the game. Sticking to the facts is a really good one. So more or unnecessary words or a long and verbose application doesn't necessarily increase your chances of success. More word count doesn't mean more success. Consider how you'll measure the success of your project or your activity. So do you have objectives? What are they? Are they SMART? Are they SMART objectives? So are they specific? Are they measurable? Are they attainable? Are they relevant? And are they time bound? I'm guessing most people have heard of SMART objectives by now, but you can simply Google SMART objectives and it comes up with a good description of those. They're a great way to ensure that you can gauge how successful your project is. If you get funded, how do you report on it later? All that sort of stuff, and it'll help you at the back end. Ensuring that the budget balances, so ensuring that the budget's accurate and it's adequate and it's reasonable and it reflects your actual project. If you don't have a balanced budget, you may already be ineligible. You might already be unsuccessful by just simply not having a balancing budget. Get the numbers right. And if you don't know numbers, that's okay. There's plenty of people that do. That's not my forte either. But there's always someone there that can help you, whether it's your bookkeeper or someone else in your organisation, maybe someone at Inner West Community Foundation, for instance. Getting someone with that reliable eye for detail as well to really proofread the application. A new eye will always pick up something, or they'll ask a question that you hadn't thought of, and it allows you to reframe and tighten up the application. There's some tips, I think.
Thanks for that, Nick. Andy M, I just wanted to put it out to you as well. Given your experience of reviewing grants in the community, would you add anything extra to what Nick has said in terms of making a submission count?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess in my role, I've looked at grants coming in and sponsorships coming in from community groups and organisations over about the last 10 years. So with the community bank, we're able to fund a lot of community organisations, and sometimes it's that there's a lot of similar things that people want. And one of the examples that I've probably got in the top of my head at the moment is I was able to sit on a panel of local residents and local businesses looking to help our local MP to go through some. It was oversubscribed by about 6 or 7 times. And so it was what stood out. So there was a lot of applications for laptops. There was lots of applications for what might be standard business requirements. And clearly they're all needed. There's no doubt about that. But the ones that stood out would have been slightly different. So yes, it might have been a laptop, but it's a laptop for a specific reason. And it was about the outcome of what that laptop was going to do, rather than saying, I just want a laptop with some software. It was the extra bit that was added on. So if you feel that it's going to be a regular piece of business software that you need, or hardware that you need, or something that you think other businesses are going to want as well, what is the outcome that piece of equipment is going to do for your business and for the community and for your customers? So probably that's the only thing I'd add, is just try and make it a little bit different.
Thanks for that insight, Andy. Appreciate it. I did have a little bit of a case study to talk about in context of the West Footscray Traders Association, just to kind of bring meaning to all these words we've been saying. So the help desk was funded thanks to a grant application that we did with the business chambers and traders groups through the Victorian government. And so that took for me to have a look on the government website. But we'd actually started, Andy and myself, with the project. How can we help local business? What does that look like? Once we formulated that idea, that's when we started looking for different various funding entities to provide dollars back in. Then we checked that it was a good match, that we're actually achieving what the grant funding body was trying to do. And then we took that next step of finding our partners and approached the West Footscray Traders Association. And they said, yeah, actually we need that type of help. So there was a match with the funding, there was a match with the partners, and in terms of the impacts of China debt that we wanted to make. Then with that particular application, sometimes a grant might have 2 stages. They'll have an expression of interest, which is basically getting a feeler for how much money people are looking for and the types of projects. And I usually find when they do an expression of interest, it's either because they're not quite sure what they want to use the funding towards, or they're not quite sure on how many people are going to go for a full application. So by doing a short expression of interest and then putting the next stage in means that they can filter through to make sure that they actually get really targeted applications. So in this case, we had an expression of interest. I took the same approach here, set up a Google document, shared it with the West Footscray Traders Association to put in. Going back on the collecting data about the local area, because this grant was specifically about how do we help traders in the time of COVID, there wasn't a lot of data at the time of the application needing to go back. So we, rather than try and find the data, we did find some of the data in some of the council reports and the like, but we had to make it up. And so we did a survey. We sent out a survey to different groups and some messages out on Facebook to try and collect that real-time information that helped contribute to this specific application. Our initial big picture project for this was much bigger, and so we had to scope it back. And the way we scoped it back was looking at the context of West Footscray and being very specific to the region and its needs. The other things that we included was a full project plan, what we were going to deliver, the full budget, and then letters of support from other entities. And so in this case, it was having the letters of support from IWCF because we were the entity that were doing it, because West Footscray Traders Association were the actual applicant, and then having letters of support from council and councillors, as well as some of the other businesses that would be benefiting from having this project run forward. And so that was the suite for that. So what happens next? Nick, do you want to talk about what happens when you get it, when you're successful?
First of all, pop the champagne, high fives, pats on back. Start with that. That's always good to celebrate the wins, because sometimes we don't get to do that. But it's important to then, I suppose, work out what your obligations might be. So generally what happens process-wise is you'll get notification that you are successful somewhere between 2 weeks and 16 weeks after your application, depending on the funding body. It can take months and months and months. So they'll usually say approximately 16 weeks or approximately 8 weeks after your application closes. That's when you'll find out. It can be longer, and it probably will be longer if it can be. But then you'll get sent a funding agreement generally, or some terms setting out what the deal is. So what do you need to do to get that money? How do you get the money? You'll probably fill in your information as far as banking accounts and things like that, whether you've got an auspice, they'll probably deal with that part of it. But otherwise, there are often obligations on you, for instance, with a lot of Creative Victoria, and that's my experience, so sorry I keep referring to that, but with Creative Victoria, they tend to have requirements for them being associated with your event. So they have wording that says, music proudly supported by Music Works, a Victorian government initiative, and that's a tagline that they expect you to put on most communications about your project and things like that. And it might even be that you need to put a logo on your artwork. So work out what it is that they require from you and your project, because if you don't meet those obligations, sometimes there's a chance for that funding to then be adjusted or even withdrawn altogether. They can also require that you do certain reporting at certain times during the project. So there might be milestone reporting, there might be progress payments and things like that. And the final thing that I'd suggest is that if there's any changes and what we call significant changes to your project, you're under an obligation generally to report those back to the funding body. So you'll probably be given a case officer or a project or a program officer. And if there's what they'd call a significant change, whether you've had a key element of your project withdraw, or you've had a change of plan, or the concept's changed, whatever it might be, they tend to want to know that sooner rather than later. It may not affect your funding, but it's about adjusting the funding agreement. And if you're unsuccessful,
I was going to say, Andy Fiddles raised his hand. What would you like to chip in with there, Andy?
Yeah, I did just want to say, just because we did bring up the case study regarding the help desk, the help desk, in this case, we have had to communicate a delay. So a real life example, this web this this online session that we're doing now is a delayed version of what the original plan was, which was in-person workshops. So this message has now been conveyed to the case manager, and so we have gone through this process. So as a real life example, where the help desk is providing for us tonight, yeah, the extension of the project. It hasn't stopped us from doing the project, but we have had to communicate the information.
Yeah, and on that note, most things never go exactly to plan, and so there is always that scope. It's just about having that good communication and looking at how you're actually going to deliver it, or how you might tweak it, or whether, you know, it means you might not be spending as much and being able to report that back to them. So I just wanted to elaborate. There's some benefits about winning a grant, which is, yes, let's celebrate, but they're all points of which you can market or publicise in your business around those successes. Like, yes, we've got the grant. That's a great one to put out. Then after you've completed different milestones, yes, we've done it. It's another touch point, photos. And then when you finished it, again, it's another touch point. And then the post review, all the information that you collect to say these are the impacts we made. That's all excellent marketing material that you can use and reuse. Nick, I wasn't sure. I know that you said, well, if you don't get it, like, did you want to elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, I think just going back one step, I think that the milestone thing and the opportunity, the marketing and promotional opportunity is a really, really good point. Both at your end and also the funding program will tend to want to capture some of those moments as well for their own purposes and for their own promotion of that program. And if you go back a step from there, you think about what does that funding, successful funding mean? Well, it means that they believe in your project, they believe in your organisation, and they believe that you're capable of doing that. So there's the messaging already that sort of narrative starts to tell it to write itself. You can then use those words to say, proudly supported by this, this program. We're really looking forward to having a positive economic or cultural impact or whatever it might be. Some really good stories to come out of that. What I didn't get to was the acquittal part. I'm not sure whether you want to talk about that separately or not, but acquitting is the part that often is forgotten about with grant funding. We've got the funding, we've done the project, sweet, we've got the money, everyone's been paid, the lights are off, but there's still someone sitting there at the funding program sending you an email saying, can I please have your funding report? Or can I have your acquittal? Can I have your financial statement? Whatever it might be. So again, those will be requirements set out in your funding agreement. And they're always something that you can find out before you apply for the government for the funding. So if you don't think that you can be bothered or have the ability to report later on, if that's too onerous on you, if they require you to have a financially audited account, they're things that you need to think about before maybe getting yourself too far into the actual application, because you will actually have to provide those things. And there can be some pretty serious implications if you don't finish the back end of a funding agreement and comply with all your obligations.
Like they won't fund you again.
Like they won't.
Yeah, exactly. It helps build that story around the credibility too, by finishing it properly.
Yeah.
I think some tips if you don't get it is go back and ask for feedback where you can. I know when Nick talked about 4 to 16 weeks time to get back to you on, I've noticed from this last year to previous years, most funding organisations have been oversubscribed, so it's taken actually past the time of which they've said, by about 2 to 3 months out of sync. So if you're not sure, you can always email to check in and get that feedback. Try again, maybe with the same funding body, but get your story right. Or look at whether there's an entity that better fits your project to give it a go. Or forget about trying to get grant funding. Who else can you partner with, or who else could you sponsor, or are there other ways that you could look at creating an income to do the project that you're doing? Or maybe it's doing a mixture of different things as well. So I think that's pretty much it to call it a wrap. Yes, Nick.
So I might just add a couple more to that if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So the specific feedback's a good one, but detailed, ask questions. They'll just basically have a script ready. But they won't necessarily have a detailed written description of why your application didn't get approved. So ask some pertinent questions, and some of the questions might be, how competitive was it in relation to successful applications? Another question might be, which criteria did it meet and which did it not meet? And if so, how highly did it rank in each criteria? Because it gives you an idea of where your weaknesses are. Was there adequate or relevant supporting material? Could you have maybe provided something more that would have helped your application be strengthened? Was there any issue with the budget or the finances, including the amount requested versus the size of the project? Was that ratio out of whack? And finally, what could just generally be improved in the future? Because chances are, if it's a highly ranking application, they will encourage you to reapply, but you need to know what you need to change to raise it up. And at the very least, if you're unsuccessful, you've got invaluable experience in relation to grant programs. You've got a really good focus on your project, and whether it goes ahead or not, you've really focused down on what your project is, and you've got a base for future applications. So you've got a whole resource base and a template for future.
Oh, that actually reminds me of one other thing in terms of getting feedback, and depending on what level it is, in getting that feedback, you can also find out who else was funded at that point in time. And if it's more locally based, it might give you an opportunity to think about how you might partner with those organisations going forward, how you can use each other's skills to actually look at building a better project. So I wanted to, since we've got Bruce in the room today, you still with us, Bruce?
I certainly am, and Annetta has texted me saying she couldn't get through the Google vortex, so she's an apologies. But happy to say a few words and answer any questions.
Yeah, Bruce, would you mind talking about the couple of grants that are available through City of Maribyrnong each year?
Yeah, certainly. So the main ones, there's three main categories. There's community grants, there's festivals grants, and then there's the business improvement district grants, each with a different focus. So obviously community is more about, community-based outcomes. Festivals, we want people to get out and about and have fun and spend their money. And then it's the business improvement districts, which is very much focused on, I guess, business outcomes, mainly in the retail activity centre precincts, and geared more towards group applications, either by trader groups or indeed collectives of businesses. 5 or more is the magic number that we've got for that, to pitch ideas where they can have collective positive outcomes for the business community.
And typically, whenabouts do they open, Bruce, the City of Maribyrnong Business Improvement District grants?
So that's a good question, and it's interesting timing. We are actually doing a bit of a review at the moment on the whole program. Certainly, we want to continue the big grant. So I think they normally would come out in sort of July, August. Although this year, I don't think we're going to hit that. We're still reviewing. We've got a meeting in early July, which gives a chance to get a bit of feedback on the direction going forward with those grants. And we're getting some feedback as well from the people who've received grants over the years, and that might shape it a little bit going forward. And we've certainly learnt a lot over the last year with COVID as well.
Yeah, because I guess something different from previous years is that you introduced the individual businesses that could apply for smaller grants, and I think they had a more digital application. So that was kind of cool to see as well. Anyway. Yeah,
look, that was certainly a reaction and response to the COVID was to let's spread the money out a bit further and we call it micro grants up to $1,500 per individual business. Look, we're not sure if they'll go again. We had to pull money from some cancelled big events to make that happen. Now the events are back up and running again. It's a bit trickier with the budget, so we'll sort of wait and see what the feedback is.
Thanks for that, Bruce. Andy, yes, Andy Fithall.
I think I'm probably going to say what you're about to say. If we could possibly also, since we've got Andy Mutro-Reid in the room, Andy, can we possibly hear a little bit about what you're up to Inner West Community Foundation?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So it's interesting, in the grant space, we're a little bit different. So I guess originally we were born out of the Seddon Community Bank, the Bendigo Bank in Seddon. So that ethos is very much all the profits that the bank makes go back into the community by grants and sponsorships, more in line to community organisations and sporting clubs. But the foundation was born out of looking at other areas where we can have an effect in our community. So we partnered with Derek Green, who was the editor of the West Sider, and we helped support and launch the West Sider back into the community. We partnered with the Footscray Rotary Club, and we launched the Bike Hub at Lickety Split, and that's about to expand into Torquay, which is quite exciting. We launched Mad Youth, which is a youth program in the community. We currently got a Money Mentor, which is a financial literacy program that we wrote with VU, and we're trialing it at Mount Alexander College, but we're also looking at putting that into community groups and organisations. And we look at financial literacy. Funny, we're talking about grants and sponsorship and small business, and being a small business owner of a number of different businesses myself, I understand the frustrations around some of the access to funding, but I think financial literacy provides young people in our community a real good grounding to understand some of the trials that are out there and some of the tests out there, but it's a real life experience for them. Community pitch, and I think that looking certainly at someone like Mary, you've been a contributor and a business partner in the community pitch, where we get businesses to collectively support projects and programs that our community organisations are looking to run. So there's a real networking event there. So the help desk and this program here is the newest of our programs, and this is really about our desire to help different areas or all areas in our community, and the business area at the moment is the one that we see has got the most amount of need, together with some of our community programs that we're looking as well. So look, I think, thanks for the opportunity to say a couple of words, Andy, but in essence is programs like this, I think this is a very good trial program for us in West Footscray, but wouldn't it be great if we could roll it out into the other areas in Maribyrnong, and then look at bringing some of these businesses together. I mean, Andy, you've had an opportunity now to interview 17, 18 different business owners one-on-one. And suddenly, if we could replicate that, the data that we have to start lobbying and working with councils and state governments around some of the needs of small businesses, I think could be really important. So, to everyone that's been involved in this, Athena, Andy, certainly Pradeep at the Traders Association, and other members of the Community Foundation. It's been great, and Nick as well. It's been good to sort of have your involvement too. So, from a foundation that I think it's been a good success so far, but it's really only the beginning, and it's just about finding out what we can do to really help the business community here. So we're genuinely keen to do that. So thanks anyway. And
Thank you, Andy. I'm thinking, Mary, unless Athena's got something more to add, Mary, John, and Teresa, have we got any questions from you guys directly while we've got this abundance of knowledge sitting here at our disposal? Is there any questions from you guys? You can pop a hand up, or a comment in the box is fine as well.
Andy, whilst people are thinking of potential questions, just further extrapolating on what Andy has talked about, what's been great being able to talk to the businesses and interview them is actually understanding what their challenges are, because that then takes you to the next step after just reading some of the commentary in the chat, which is around that advocacy part, which is there's departments, whether it's state, council level or federal level, that don't always understand what the actual needs are. And so when we have an evidence base like these interviews, we can actually start that conversation to say, well, this is what the priorities are for our communities, to rethink about some of the guidelines around how the funding gets used and towards what. So you don't often think about that when you're looking at your specific grant application, but there is room to advocate to those different government entities to address where the need is greater, especially when it comes to small business or communities or not-for-profit type entities. So I'll throw it back. I'm not sure if any, if John, Teresa and Mary might have a question.
Well, we've got Teresa and John have both said no questions at this stage. Mary, was there anything else you wanted to add? You did. Have you applied for grants before? Any specific troubles you had?
I'll put my mic on. Yeah, so I've done arts grants, but more on behalf of my partner, who's a sculptor artist. But as I said before, I've always found it difficult in terms of doing. We've run in the past a lot of large arts events. We did actually get some funding through Big West, which was actually not Big West at the time. That's when they just changed over to was it not Way Out West? So we've had one event that we were fully funded, which was so fantastic because I wasn't scraping the barrel to try and pay all my artists and performers and visual artists and things like that. And, you know, in this space, I would like to see, I guess this is more of a comment than a need. Well, it is a need, but I would like to see more partnership between the arts and business. And often, you know, business is sometimes poo-pooed as sort of having a different agenda to the arts, but it's not always the case. I mean, there's lots of businesses that are very community-focused and very arts-orientated, and I think that there would be, you know, great power between the two coupling, and that's always how we've worked. We've collaborated with different artists. We've always found a way through sponsorship or what have you to pay them, but it would be lovely to see a bit more of a fit between business and the arts.
That's great. Thanks for sharing, Mary. Athena, also, we'll get all of the links that you showed. Thank you, Nick, for some of those links in the comments. We'll get the links that you have shared with us tonight. We'll get a list of those out as well, so there's no need to worry about scrambling for those. Apart from that, I'm just trying to see whether or not, does anyone have any other, while we've got everyone together, is there any other questions that we might have regarding grants and grant writing? I think the general theme, Athena, and this is coming from my personal experience of not being someone involved with grants, is the key takeaways for me here is that you want to be doing this to help progress something that you need, not just put some money in your pocket, because there's no such thing as free money. At the end of the day, there's still obligations involved in getting the money, and you really want to be using that to on a project that you've already sort of wanting to work on, not finding a project to do to get the money. That for me is one of the key takeaways.
Yeah, absolutely. Start with what your needs are so that you're working towards your end goal, because it'll just keep on feeding back. It's worthwhile then doing. Absolutely.
If I can add to, sorry, Andy, to jump in there. I just wanted to add that a good sort of litmus test or a heat test for your project is ideally, will it go ahead, and is it commercial? Will it go ahead with or without the funding? If it's going to go ahead without funding regardless, then that's always a good test that it's worth chasing some funding for. It means it sort of passes your, is it vital to the business test?
Yeah, that's great. It's a different way of thinking, isn't it? Rather than just, I could do with a bit of extra cash. Athena, did you have something else to add?
No, I was just agreeing with Nick. It's that, would you take the risk yourself on that project? Would you give it money? So yeah, absolutely spot on with that. It's as simple as that.
All right. Well, that's thank you so much. I think we've got Andy Moutre Reid wants to have a say yet. Andy,
just one quick one, and I know that Athena, we've spoken about this before, was collaborative funding. With small businesses. I mean, for example, we were able to secure funding here through the Traders Association, but I really do feel that as the Traders Association becomes more active and more connected, and as it starts to, we start to do some workshops and work closer, I think the idea of collaborative funding is, and I'm just sort of thinking that Mary, you were connecting before with, is it Therese that left? Yep. So you're connecting with, and it just sort of resonates. You sit there and go, just in this very simple, small forum, two people are connected saying, hang on, we've got a very similar sort of require for arts funding. So I feel that there's a real space for collaborative funding at some stage as well, looking at the way that business is sort of segmented across the strip in West Footscray, and maybe there are some arts related businesses that could apply for arts grants together. And I think that adds some capacity and some depth in their grant applications.
Nick.
Another thing that I didn't mention was that don't be afraid to apply for funding from more than one source. Some people are worried that if they get money from there, then they can't get money from there. It's generally the opposite. Generally, it gives you proof of product or proof of project. If you've got funding from somewhere, then that's safe money. It's confirmed. It's a tick. All of a sudden, you've got some guaranteed contribution to your project, and then you can go to another funding source, whether it's federal, whether it's local, whether it's state government. They really love to see, because it means that someone else has agreed that it's worth funding, so therefore, why wouldn't they?
I think that's a really good point. Athena, you've got your hand up there.
Sorry, that was a click of an accent, or I've forgotten exactly what I was going to say. But I think that pretty much covers it. Actually, it was a bit about what Mary said, and Nick and Andy. It's that I think there's a real potential for looking at, for example, art or live music performances, how you can integrate those with the retailers. It's a real potential for good collaboration with a number of and groups, whether you do that through the Traders Association or independent smaller projects with a number of businesses. From these series of interviews, there's some real good opportunities there to do some really interesting stuff, I think.
Happy to help.
Yeah. I'd love to see a couple of workshops to help facilitate that in the future.
Very good. All right, well, I think the other thing I must mention is I have put this survey link in the comments there. So it's just a quick survey to let us know what you thought of the information presented this evening, whether or not you thought it was valuable or not, if there's anything else that you currently need. I mean, Mary, it feels like an eternity ago I sat down with you to talk about this. So things have changed a lot since we spoke, aka 4.0 lockdown. So there is a question about that in the survey, and also the potential to do something else in the very near future. So please let us know what you need, and then we can possibly facilitate that. So the link is in the chat room there. I will send out the link afterwards as well. But I would say thank you so much for coming along tonight. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Athena, for the wealth of knowledge, and Nick, of course, for all the extra information that you've also provided. Thank you so much, Bruce, for coming along, representing council there. Teresa, we haven't met. I have only just met you today, John, but great to connect with you guys. Mary, I'm sure I'll see you again sometime in the near future. And of course, it's a pleasure. Andy, thank you for coming along.
I think Mary has a hand up.
Oh.
Is there any opportunity to say, Nick and Bruce, I mean, you're great resources to have. Like, is there any opportunity to share contacts in terms of, like, I don't know how to contact you, Nick. So, but yeah, look, I mean, there is obviously opportunity for collaborations within this. It would be great to be able to have access to contacts.
Yeah, so Athena, maybe on the grant side of things.
So, Mary, what I'll be sending out after this is just two PDFs, one which goes through a summary of everything that was presented today, another one which gives all the links that we've gone through, and there will be some contact details in there for people to either through the help desk or how they can get in contact with Nick specifically, if that's the case too.
Perfect, thank you.
And get in contact with Andy if there's more community-based type stuff that we want to look at.
Yeah,
Yep.
sure. And we'll pop Bruce's contact in there, information as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just put it in there. I'm happy for people to contact me directly or through the council reception. It's fine as well.
Yep. Great. Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. It's been a pleasure. Go and pop your moccasins on and put your feet up. It's cold, drizzly night in Melbourne, but it doesn't mean we can't learn something and get on the front foot with progressing business, even in a lockdown environment. So thank you so much for coming. And we do have our next workshop next Tuesday, which is on demystifying SEO. What is SEO? How does it work? We'll have another guest speaker running that workshop, and we'll be here. So for those of you who have signed up, we'll see you then. Otherwise, thanks for coming. Have a good night.